Chapter 1. "Oh my goodness, it's Jonas Lane," exclaimed Miss Cockerell suddenly. She forgot about showing proper respect due to being a minister's wife and the need for modesty, leaving her chair to peer through her window filled with geraniums. She watched with great interest as a man got out of a buggy in front of her neighbour's house. He secured his horse and then walked slowly towards the door. "He seems to have gained weight," Miss Cockerell continued. She moved a bit to the side to share the view with her visitor, not missing any of the unfolding scene as the man rang the doorbell and waited for it to be answered. "She's making him wait, just like she's been doing for 20 years, she remarked. The door that he knocked on closed as the man entered, leaving Miss Cockerell unable to see further. She turned to her visitor with an explanation. "You know, Mrs. Webster, I've known Martha Waring since we were little. She was born in that house and I was born in this one. Now we're the only ones left from our families, so I feel like I know more about her than I know about myself." It's possible that Mrs. Webster, who had recently moved to Ackerton from places with less personal familiarity, didn't discourage the revelations she often heard. Instead, she seemed to consider them like roses along the sometimes challenging path of young ministers and their wives. "That kind of friendship is nice," she said. "Not many friendships survive from childhood. You're lucky to have such good friends." "Well, it's a shame she doesn't see it that way," Miss Cockerell replied somewhat sternly. "She might even tell Jonas Lane to go back out west." "Jonas Lane?" Mrs. Webster questioned with curiosity. "Mr. Lane? I don't remember that name." "No, you wouldn't," Miss Cockerell answered quickly. "His family's all gone like ours, and he left 20 years ago after he proposed to Martha the first time." "Oh," Mrs. Webster exclaimed politely, but her look encouraged Miss Cockerell to continue. "He's only come back twice since then. Once when he proposed to her the second time, and then the third time. Now I guess he's trying for the fourth." She glanced out of the window again, toward the house where such an important event might be happening. The house, however, showed no sign of passion. It stood in its yard shaded by maple trees, neat and respectable in its dove-coloured siding, more like a man-made creation than a part of nature, and seemingly unconcerned about human emotions. Both women gazed at it in silence for a moment. Then Miss Cockerell turned to her friend once again. "I don't know how she can say no to him this time. You see, the first time she had her parents and Anne. Her father was very sickly and Anne took after him. They both stayed in bed for years. Father Waring because he fell from the hayloft. Anne did because her father did, I guess. Anyway, when Jonas first proposed to Martha 20 years ago, she said she liked him enough, but she couldn't leave her family while they needed her. So Jonas got really upset and went out west. He did quite well there. He got into the lumber business and now he's a wealthy man. But he never forgot Martha, even with all his success. He was always faithful, like you'd want to see, from the time we were all kids in school together." Miss Cockerell's gaze returned to the dove-coloured house with a nostalgic look that caught Mrs. Webster's attention. "He asked me to keep him updated about what happened here. He wasn't good at writing, and Martha wasn't either. So after her father passed away, he came back. She told him she wasn't ready, though, and the same thing happened when Anne left. Martha said she still liked him a lot, maybe even more, but she felt responsible for her mother. Jonas then joked that he'd marry her mother as well. Jonas always had a way with jokes, but Martha said her mother wanted to spend her last days at home, so Jonas had to leave again the third time. It seems like Martha understood her own feelings better than most people." Once more, Miss Cockerell paused for a moment, her gaze fixed on the significant grey house. "That was 12 years ago," she continued, "and it's been less than 2 weeks since Mrs. Waring was buried, and now Jonas is back at Martha's door again. I guess she'll have to let him in this time. Anyway, I'll know as soon as anyone. Jonas always promised he'd tell me first." To Mrs. Webster, it seemed that there was a certain similarity between the neatly painted wooden boards that had caught her attention and the somewhat mysterious exterior of her hostess. There was more beneath the surface. As for Miss Cockerill, her gaze held an intensity that even walls of brass couldn't resist. And as if the house could no longer keep its secret from her, Jonas Lane suddenly appeared on the porch. "He's coming this way now, I think," exclaimed Miss Cockerill with excitement, trying to see without making it obvious from outside. However, Jonas strode down the path, untied his horse, threw the halter into the back of the buggy, got in more quickly than before, and drove away swiftly. Miss Cockerill watched the buggy until it vanished down the long row of elm trees. Then, after another look at the grey house, she turned to her guest. "Well, I declare," she exclaimed, "she's turned him down again." Chapter 2. When Jonas Lane knocked on Martha Waring's door for the 4th time, he felt a curious mix of excitement and amusement. Things seemed tidier than the last time, he thought, looking at the shiny doorknob, the door panels, the slightly slanting veranda, and the path leading to the kitchen. That hemlock tree has grown quite a bit too, but Martha never kept me waiting this long before, he muttered impatiently. Gradually the door began to open, revealing a gap where a small animal or a lady's head might fit through. A lady's head indeed appeared. It was Miss Waring, ready to talk through the half-opened door. "Jonas, is that really you?" she exclaimed, a small smile appearing on her face. "Just the same old me," replied Jonas, extending his hand. Seeing this familiar face, Miss Waring widened the opening and invited him inside. It was not only the right and kind thing to do, but she also had a feeling that the neighbours might be watching. Closing the door quietly, she led him into the living room, pulled up the blinds, and sat down across from him. Truth be told, Miss Waring hadn't received any immediate notice of this visit, Jonas not being particularly good at writing, as Miss Cockerill had mentioned to Mrs. Webster. Nonetheless, she had a sense from experience that Jonas would show up not long after any changes in her family's routine. On this occasion, she felt more uncertain than ever. The final battle was lost, and now the intruder threatened her very presence. She was torn between surrendering and resisting until the end. She wished she had more time to decide. It was clear that Jonas too, as he sat fidgeting with his hat and looking around the room, felt a bit less confident than usual. However, it was the woman who broke the silence by saying, "I hope you're feeling good, Jonas. You look just the same as always." "Thank you, Marthy," replied her conversation partner. "You're looking pretty much the same too, but I hope you're feeling different." And before Miss Waring could recover from this direct statement, Jonas continued, "You know I'm not good at beating around the bush, Marthy. I might as well tell you right now what I've come for. I guess you already know, though, without me saying. You've had plenty of chances to understand what it means when I come here. But this time, I'm not leaving without you. Will you be with me now, Marthy?" He got up from the sofa and came closer to her. But then he paused, feeling very awkward. His strong desire for closeness had no clear plan, and he wasn't sure what to do next. Martha, on the other hand, put out her hands as if to stop him and exclaimed, "Oh, Jonas, please don't say such things." Although it was unexpected, his words made him more certain. Sitting next to the woman he cared for, Jonas placed a rugged finger on her knee. "I know it might not be right to come to you so suddenly, Martha, especially just after you've lost your mother. But if anyone can comfort you, it's me. I just couldn't wait any longer. I've waited quite a long time, Marthy." Martha pushed away the daring finger and covered her face with her hands, like a startled creature in a corner. "Oh, please, Jonas," she moaned. Her gentle companion didn't try anything more, but looked at her in surprise. "Marthy," he groaned. "What do you mean?" There was something in his tone that finally made Martha respond, hesitatingly. I mean, Jonas, that I just can't go back with you." Jonas initially couldn't speak. Then he said seriously, "You're only joking and avoiding the truth, Marthy. That's how women often do. But why play games with me? You can't really mean it. Didn't you always tell me that you liked me a lot, and that when there was nothing holding you back, you would come?" Martha regained some of her composure, allowing her hands to rest in her lap again, but her flushed cheeks and voice revealed the emotional struggle she was experiencing. "I know, Jonas," she said, "and I meant it. But somehow, now that the time has come, it feels different. I really do like you a lot, and I always did. But it seems like I can't leave this old house where I was born and where all my family passed away and go off to be with strangers. I just can't, Jonas." After saying this, she raised a neatly folded handkerchief to her eyes and held it there. Poor Jonas watched with the twofold helplessness of a man facing a woman's tears and a lover dealing with his beloved's uncertainties. He had no idea what all of this could mean. Yet he felt somewhat wronged, although a deep respect inclined him to a pacifying mood. "But you made a promise, Marthy," he said gently, "and how can you live here all alone? Who will take care of you?" "I know I promised, Jonas," Miss Waring tearfully murmured, "and I really don't want to go back on my word. But I'm feeling now that maybe I shouldn't have promised in the first place, that I could never actually do it. You don't need to worry about me living alone, though. I've always taken care of others, rather than them taking care of me. I wouldn't even know what to do in a new house, with everything being taken care of for me." For a moment, Jonas appeared uncertain. But then, he exclaimed, "Well, bless your heart, Marthy, that's an easy thing to solve. You don't have to go away and have others look after you. You can stay right here, and I'll come and live with you instead of taking you away. That way, you'll still have someone to take care of." At this sudden change of attitude, Miss Waring lowered her flag of truce and looked at the other person suspiciously. "What's the matter, Marthy?" inquired the man with concern. "Wouldn't that work for you?" It seemed that Martha had never considered such an option, and she soon voiced her uncertainty about it. "I never thought about that, Jonas," she said slowly. "It would feel so strange to live here and have a stranger in the house." "A stranger, Marthy," Jonas protested sadly. "Me, a stranger? And whose fault is it if I'm a stranger to you? But let's not dwell on that," he quickly added. "Just give me a chance, and we'll become familiar enough, will you, Marthy, dear?" He said the last word timidly and moved closer to her. This woman felt her heart like water within her. In fact, a little of it came out from her eyes, making Jonas Lane even more confused and distressed. "What's wrong, Marthy?" he exclaimed. "Please tell me. I don't want to make you feel sad, believe me. I just want to make you happy and be happy with you, something I've looked forward to for 20 years. "I know, Jonas," the woman he admired admitted, "and I don't like being like this, but it would be so strange, and if you came here, I guess we'd have to be married." As she paused, fidgeting with a fold of her skirt, the puzzled Jonas interjected, "I think we'd have to, Marthy." "Oh, Jonas, please don't," begged Miss Waring with a deeply embarrassed face. "I just meant that I could never go through it and live." "What do you mean, Marthy?" Jonas asked, completely bewildered. "Well," explained Miss Waring hesitantly, "I mean that there would have to be a dress. And I could never go to the store and ask for white satin and buy many yards of it and take it to Hannah Lee to make me a wedding gown. I really couldn't do that. Everyone would know and talk, and I couldn't handle it." "I guess they'd have to know," Jonas said apologetically. "I'm too big to be hidden, is that all?" "No," Martha persisted, driving another painful point into her lover's heart. "There would have to be a wedding." "I'll do a lot for you, Jonas, but I can't stand up with you in front of the minister and have everyone whispering about Martha Waring and her old beau Jonas Lane and how they finally got married, and it's a shame they didn't do it sooner." "It is a shame, Marthy," the mournful Jonas admitted. But that's not the worst part," Martha continued, her imagination painting the whole grim picture. "The worst would be the rice. They would throw it at us when we left, and people on the train would see, and it would stick to our clothes and follow us everywhere, and everyone would know and laugh. Oh, Jonas, I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't." To poor Jonas, a world of unexpected feminine complexity had suddenly been unveiled. He felt trapped in a web. After gazing silently at his beloved for a few moments, he spoke again. "Marthy Waring," he asked earnestly, "would you marry me if we could do it without rice, without a wedding dress, and without anyone knowing?" She looked at him uncertainly. "It feels like it wouldn't really be a proper marriage," she hesitated, inadvertently revealing her thoughts. Jonas's face clouded with despair. What was left to hope for after this? Yet Martha, with a sense of shame, returned to her stance. "I truly would, Jonas, if I could." "Honestly, Marthy, will you give your word?" asked Jonas, his confidence growing. "Well, yes, Jonas, if there was a way," replied the anxious target. "Great! We'll elope then. And now that you've promised, I'm going to sort things out," exclaimed the triumphant Jonas as he got up and quickly left before Miss Waring could object again. Miss Waring, flustered and taken aback, had no time to object to the unfair advantage that had been taken of her vulnerable state. Chapter 3. Miss Cockerill felt torn between anger and curiosity. What she had expected had finally occurred, and neither Jonas Lane nor Martha Waring had shared a single word about it with her. She supposed she'd have to call her Martha Lane now. It was unbelievable how ungrateful they were. She had known them for so many years. Jonas Lane had practically been her sweetheart as much as Martha's. She didn't know who to be more upset with. Jonas, who had promised to tell her before anyone else in the world except Martha, or Martha, who had always confided in her since she was old enough to have something to share. But she couldn't just stay there next door without saying anything. It would be strange, given how well they all knew each other. She couldn't wait to hear all the details. The thought of them eloping and getting married like that, stirring up gossip among everyone, was quite something. So, setting aside her pride, a common practice in Ackerton, and draping a shawl over her head, she walked over to Martha's kitchen door. Martha opened it with a self-conscious smile. "Well, Susan, we thought we might need to come see you first." Miss Cockerill observed her friend curiously. However, the change in Martha's emotional state didn't seem to reflect in her appearance. "I would have appreciated a visit, Martha," the visitor replied. "You and Jonas eloping like that caught me by surprise." While Miss Cockerill tried to hide the depth of her feelings, Mrs. Lane still managed to sense it. "I understand, Susan," exclaimed the matron. "It took mine away too, and I've hardly recovered. But Jonas insisted on it." With this interesting revelation, she guided her friend towards the sitting room. "Come in and let's chat a bit. I haven't seen you in a while, and dinner can wait." As they entered, Miss Cockerill glanced around. It seemed to her that such significant events should have left some trace on their surroundings. Yet the old house appeared just as she had known it for nearly 50 years. Mrs. Lane noticed these looks and interpreted them in her own way. "No, he's not here," she smiled. "As he says, there's too much of him to be hidden. He went down to the store for some trading. But let me share the whole story with you. It's only fair, since you're such an old friend to both of us." With these words, the two ladies settled in for a lengthy conversation. "You see, it happened like this," began the bride, looking at her apron as if seeking guidance. "You know how things always were between Jonas and me." "Yes," Miss Cockerill acknowledged with a mysterious air. And you're aware of how I always felt, as long as any of my family were alive, that my first duty was to them. Yes, Miss Cockerill repeated. Well, when Jonas came this time, shortly after my mother's passing, I was quite distressed. I think it was the change, the solitude, and not having anyone to care for. When he mentioned taking me away, I couldn't bring myself to leave. So we decided that he would come here instead, and I can't help but feel relieved that it worked out this way. It's not as difficult for him as it would be for me to go all the way out to where he lives. Where he used to live, suggested Miss Cockerill. Mrs. Lane accepted the correction with a smile. And when we discussed things, we agreed that we didn't want any public attention, especially with me in mourning, Mrs. Lane explained, noticing the impact of this detail. We were uncertain about how to proceed, though. Jonas suggested going before a justice of the peace, but I told him it wouldn't feel right if we weren't married by a minister. Then he proposed that we should go somewhere and get married secretly by a different minister, so no one would know until it was done. He called it eloping, like in a storybook. But I insisted I wouldn't have any dramatic actions like in novels, and that if I couldn't be married by my own minister, I wouldn't marry at all. Goodness me, exclaimed Miss Cockerill. After all the years he's waited, I had a feeling you told him something, though, based on the way he left the house the day he returned. I mentioned it to Mrs. Webster. She was with me at the time. Really? It was Mrs. Webster who sorted things out with Jonas in the end. It left me quite exhausted, and he told me to let him handle it, and he would arrange for us to be married by the minister without any big celebration, or rice, she added. How did they make it happen? Miss Cockerill inquired. Well, I invited the minister and his wife, along with Jonas, to come over for dinner, the bride explained. Naturally, I would have invited you too, Susan, if I had anyone outside of that. But Mrs. Webster needed to be informed since she's the minister's wife. She actually took charge of the arrangements, and since it was another woman handling it, it felt better to have her there. I felt guilty for not telling you, Susan. Whatever thoughts Miss Cockerill held, she concealed them well under a facade of impatience. What happened next? She asked. Well, before we sat down for dinner, the two of us stood in front of Mr. Webster, and he married us. After that, we just took our seats as if nothing had happened. I was so nervous, though, worried that someone might come in before we could start eating, that I kept looking out the window the whole time. What were you wearing? Miss Cockerill asked. You didn't have much time to prepare. No, I didn't want to fuss too much, especially since I'm in mourning, and you know how Hannah Lee can't keep a secret. So I just wore my grey silk dress, and Jonas said we could get anything else we needed while we were away. Oh, exclaimed Miss Cockerill, and then Mr. and Mrs. Webster left, carrying my bag with the few things I needed, and Jonas went back to the hotel, and I stayed behind to do the dishes. Why did they do that? Asked Miss Cockerill. I would have thought Jonas should have stayed with his own wife. No, I didn't want him to. People might have found it strange if they walked in. And the Websters took my bag because they were going to be in their carriage down at the end of the garden, and I was going out, as if to pick chrysanthemums, and they were going to invite me for a ride. Why on earth did you go through all of that? Demanded the determined Susan. Well, it was to be less noticeable, explained Mrs. Lane. They had just finished dinner here and left, and if they had returned afterward, it might have seemed odd. I wanted it to appear as if I ran into them by chance out back. After I finished the dishes and tidied everything up, and the house was locked up for leaving, I went upstairs to get ready. But when the moment arrived, I felt like I couldn't move at all. I stood at the back door in my outfit and couldn't make myself go. Only the thought of Jonas travelling alone on the train got me moving. So I quietly opened the door, stepped outside as gently as I could, locked it behind me, and headed for the garden. I was certain that you or someone else would see me and call out, and I didn't know what I'd say. I was so scared I could hardly see. I even heard some sort of noise, which made me start running. I ran so quickly that I actually fell down, Susan, flat on the ground. "Goodness!" exclaimed the sympathetic listener. "Did you ruin your dress?" Pretty close. I was covered in dirt by the time I reached the carriage, and I was so out of breath that I couldn't even speak, and I was so nervous that I felt like crying. I think I might have cried a little too. But Mrs. Webster held my hand, and Mr. Webster chatted about the weather, crops, Jonas, and everything else, just like it was all normal. Eventually, I started feeling better, and we had a really nice ride to West Carthage. Jonas met you there, I assume? No, not right then. I wouldn't have wanted that. There are so many people from Ackerton who go to West Carthage. So, you didn't leave together at all? Asked Miss Cockerell with a touch of sarcasm. Of course we did, exclaimed the bride. Jonas arrived on the train. He was in the second-to-last car, sitting in the 10th seat from the back on the right side, away from the station. We got there just a little before the train was due, and you couldn't have guessed who was leaving. When the train arrived, Mrs. Webster gave me a kiss. Mr. Webster shook my hand, and they both said nice things, hoping I'd find Jonas okay. Then I got on the train just as it was starting. And did you find Jonas okay? Asked the curious Miss Cockerell. You know well enough you don't need to ask that, Susan Cockerell, said Mrs. Lane. You always find Jonas when he says so. He was right there where he said, looking as if he'd just stolen cream. I should think he'd have been scared when the train started and you weren't there. I don't know. If he was, he didn't show it. He just said he was used to waiting for me. For a moment, Miss Cockerell looked at her friend without saying anything. Then she said somewhat mysteriously, Well, if I'd known it was as easy as that to get married, I would have done it myself.